So first things first, I announced this on Discord, but we do have a t-shirt winner, which is this one. Second thing, we have officially announced the Game Jam dates, if you haven't heard already. Those will be March 24th through 26th. It will be from 7 p.m. on the 24th through 7 p.m. on the 26th. Then we have the showcase after, as always. And that will also be in the same room as it was last time, which is Ellings 308. So if that's something you're interested in, that is when that will be. Yeah. Now for actual slides. Cool. More announcements, even though I just said some. Next Tuesday, here in this room, we will have a music workshop. So this will be a little bit music theory, a little bit software, like music software stuff, I believe. So we have a member leading that. And then also next Friday will be the first Friday of the month, which means we will have a social night. So that'll be in Marston, 2200 again, 7 to 11. Again, if you have anything you want to bring, board games, video games, friends, if you have any, you're welcome to bring those. So, does anybody have any questions on any of that? Cool. Oh, also one more thing. So I sent out an announcement about this as well. I've been sending out a lot recently. Sorry, but not sorry. If you have anything you're interested in that's game development related, whether it's like art design or some YouTuber you really like that does game development, I don't care. If you have something you'd like to talk about for like 5 to 15 minutes, I think we're going to try to do a meeting where we have just like anybody that comes up, gives a little talk about something that you're interested in. Maybe you want to get other people interested in it. Maybe it's something that's kind of niche, nobody's really heard about that you really like. If you're interested in doing something like that, DM me. It doesn't have to be long. You could do it with a friend. If you make slides about it, that's or like some visual thing, let me know. I'll probably just download them all on my computer just so you don't have to keep switching computers. And then also that also gives me a chance just to look through it and make sure that it's like it makes sense, easy to follow. So if that's something you want to do, DM me on Discord. So yeah. So finally, while you're all here, hopefully, we're going to talk about getting the most out of what you make. This is going to be a lot of talking about reusing stuff for the most part, but we also have a couple other like tips just from making mini games before. So first thing is just reusable assets in general. This includes a wide topic of things. Pretty much everything you use to make a video game is an asset. First and foremost, we'll just reusable assets mostly includes like code is probably the first thing that's going to come to mind. If you do any programming, more often than not, you're going to use something in one game that you're probably going to recode in another game. And it's pretty important that you make it in such a way that you can reuse it in other projects. That saves a lot of time, and it saves a lot of brain power and stress since you don't have to keep remaking it every time. In addition to that, there's also other things. We'll actually go into each of these individually in different slides. But reusable art and models is a big thing. Like we did the skeletal animation workshop recently, and I believe that's something you could reuse, but also with any like 3D things, definitely can reuse it. If you make like one character running around, you could probably just switch out the model and use the same animation. That saves you a lot of time, so you don't have to keep remaking everything. Same with sound effects. That one's pretty straightforward. If you make one game with sound effects, unless it becomes super popular, you could probably reuse those in another project, just so you don't have to spend a lot of time searching for stuff or buying new stuff or whatever. And then same with shaders. Shaders themselves are reusable. Like, I don't know, I can't list a single time when a shader is not reusable. But you can also use shaders to make other assets reusable, and we'll talk about that more. And then also, you can download other people's stuff, which we also talk about, free things mostly. So.
Who here has made more than one game project before, or worked on more than one game project before? Game jams count. Okay.
Most people.
Have you guys reused any of your stuff before between projects?
Only
Could
one.
you give me like an example, Jimmy? Piece of code, piece of
Make
art.
a platformer, right? Do coding and gravity.
Okay, that's a good one.
Just copy and paste over.
Yeah, that's a great example. So like physics for a game, for example, is a really good idea of something you could transfer over between projects, especially if the projects are very similar in scale and scope.
Mm-hmm. Next slide. So, first thing we're going to talk about is code. Probably the most obvious one. I highly recommend you look at making a library if you write a lot of code. This is basically just a collection of code that you can create that you can easily import into different projects so that you can keep using them. So if you make, I have an example that I'll show you, but if you make like one class that you really like, instead of copying and pasting it, if you create it in the library, then when you update the library, it'll automatically update in the other code bases that you have. So say that you make some class and you find out there's a bug in your code. Well, then you're like, crap, now I gotta go fix all of the different copy and paste that I've done. Whereas if it's in a library, you just fix it there, and then that will automatically transfer over to your other projects. Generics are another thing, if you're familiar with programming. Generics are very useful. They basically let you make a template that you can swap out different types for. I can go more into detail with that later if you're not familiar with what generics are, but they're very useful. I'd recommend just Googling it and looking into it if you don't know. Also, saving stuff in different locations. You can just save it on your computer. You can just leave it in the project, I guess, but I recommend either saving your code in a different folder or something that you can reference later, or a GitHub page is always useful, especially if you're doing a library. GitHub pages are probably the best way to go, just so it's always there. Say that your computer gets ruined or something, you know, at least it's still online. And if you create things with reusability in mind, that'll save you a lot of time in the future, making multiple projects that are very similar. And I put reduce, reuse, recycle. I know it's like for recycling or whatever, but it also applies to code, because you can reduce the amount of code that you write if you write code that you can reuse in the future. And then say that you have something that's similar, you can recycle it, in quotes, that lets you like kind of change that. So, do you have any comments?
Yeah, and all this applies to stuff you find online as well. If people are making stuff already, you can reuse some of their code too. Make sure that, of course, that it's available for you to use, and that you're not just stealing it, or there's licenses for it. And we'll talk about this more later with other assets, but that's of course always a great option. So Mitch is going to show you guys an example of some of the coding libraries that you can look at.
Okay. I'm actually just going to show you one of mine that I've made. So this is a library I made called TallySoft, Tallyit software. Anyways, I ended up reusing a lot of code for a lot of things that I had written, so I ended up just making my own generic library that I can import to other projects. Probably one of the most useful things in here is this class I made called PactInt, and this just lets you store like smaller numbers inside of one integer. The only time I've really ever used this though is when I'm sending stuff to the graphics card, just because you want to reduce the amount of data you use. But like another example, let's see, like the debugging, I made this class called the logger, and I use this a lot in Unity projects. So if you have Unity projects that freeze up, you can't really get the debug console messages because the editor is frozen. However, if you debug it to a text file, it will keep doing so as Unity is frozen. So that eventually once you close Unity, all of the stuff that is outputted will be in there. This is very useful if you have something that's kind of extensive that you like have a hard time debugging. This helps with that a lot. But I put this all just in a library so that I can import it to any Unity project I want to use it in, and then use that code there. So this also has an MIT license, so if you want to use any of this code, you're more than welcome. Just copy and paste it. Yeah, which is what that license is. So. Continuing on. Reusable models and art.
Okay. All right, so you reuse art assets a lot. That's like a huge part of game development, is like taking an art asset and trying to get the most out of it, because art assets take a long time to make. And the more you can reuse those art assets, also the less space you'll use with your game as well. So just kind of examples of reusing art assets. For starters, the easiest thing is just do what's called a palette swap. So you take either the image or maybe the textures that go on the image, and you simply swap around the colors until you get a different looking result. A really famous example of this is the Dragon Quest series of games. So you can see here we have an image of a bunch of characters from Dragon Quest. You can see that a lot of them are the exact same character, just palette swapped a bunch of times across. And again, that applies a lot for models, because models use textures, and you can really easily modify those textures to have different colors, or you can use what's called a shader, which we'll talk about later, to modify the colors without even having to modify the textures directly. And then you can also just simply modify an existing model or image just slightly to give it kind of different characteristics. Again, going back to the Dragon Quest example, these are all from one species of monster called a slime. And you can see a lot of them are very similar. Some of them have gone completely off the rails, they've completely redesigned the character, but some of them are simply like making the sprite a lot larger, adding a crown to the sprite, adding a tail, adding wings, so on and so forth, and they make an entirely new character out of that. A lot of this stuff was done because back in the day they had size limitations on the cartridges that they put the games on, but nowadays they've kind of kept up the tradition with designing characters, even the more modern 3D games that they're working on. Anything to add to that?
Not really.
Okay.
Another example we have is Minecraft. In this case, all you're doing is swapping out the textures on different models necessarily, like the blocks. You can consider that a model in quotes. And this kind of creates a lot of depth, just like an example of being able to reuse something. So.
And a really cool example with this is that you have the pixelated look of vanilla Minecraft, and then you also have the really high-resolution cartoony look of this texture pack here. So if you look especially at like the plants that are growing, you can get a lot more detail with the high-resolution texture pack than you can with just the base pack.
Next is audio. This one's more simple as far as like how you have to think about it. But like sample packs are a good example of something that you can get off the internet. If you don't know what that is, it's basically just a collection of generic sounds. Like an example would be like a man clapping, or like a jumping sound or something. I don't know, like two pots clanging together. Something really simple that you can use for different sorts of things other than just that. But like an example would be like a reloading noise for a shotgun or something. Doesn't necessarily have to be an actual shotgun reloading. If you use a camera shutter and you like slow it down a little bit, it actually sounds really similar. And especially with the visuals inside of a video game, the player wouldn't even notice unless they're really good at detecting audio, I guess. But that's like something that you can reuse for other things. You can easily pull that into another project and use that different sound there. And then another example would be that you can actually combine sounds together to make different sounds, which I believe we have an example of here in a second. But then that can also create new things. If you use like different pitches, different noises, you can mix and match those with different things and then make it sound more unique than the actual just raw sound itself.
So just kind of going off what Mitch said with the different sounds to create new ones, that's actually usually what most sound effects are made out of. They're usually not just one raw sound effect that's slightly edited. It's usually a bunch of sound effects that are layered together to create a new sound. And that's really useful if you download like a sample pack. You can go through and pick out a bunch of stuff, combine it with some stuff you recorded yourself, and create an entirely new sound. And again, we're going to go into that in just a second, a really cool video clip. But sample packs are really cool, mainly because you can go and find sample packs that were used in other games, and because they're usually a source that is online for money that you can pay for and get the license to, you can also have those sound effects in your projects as well. So if you're trying to mimic a style or mimic a game, you can find some of these sample packs that game used, and then you can then use them yourself legally in your projects, which is really cool. A couple really popular ones that have used sample packs were like Jet Set Radio, if anybody's heard of that. Hideki Naganuma, who does the music for that and some of the Sonic games and stuff like that, he would use samples from sample packs in his music. And now people are going and taking some of those samples and remixing them into new music tracks to kind of emulate the kind of game style. That's also being done in games like the Wario Land series. That it was really unique, and they used a lot of voice samples in that from sample packs. And now those voice samples are getting put into more modern games that are stylized like Wario Land. Yeah, so moving on to the next slide. I have this clip here. Oh, does it not show up? Oh, there we go.
No, it
Okay,
doesn't.
good. So we have this clip here from the Hyperlight Drifter team. You guys heard of that game before? The sound and music of the game is very unique. And the sound designer has made a couple videos through the GDC of how he's kind of worked with it. And I just want to show off the part where he really breaks down how he puts together sounds for the games he works on.
Hold on. Oh boy.
It should be
Hey.
big noise.
So to do that, I did a technique that basically all sound design uses, and that's called layering. So every time you hear any sort of sound effect in most any game or movie or any piece of media, every single sound is made up of multiple things playing at the same time. And the sound I'm about to play for you here is the Diamond Shotgun. And what that is made up of 9 different layers for each and every shot that you pull. And there's 2 different versions of this, but I'm just going to isolate one version for you. So in this video, this is just a video of me in Logic Pro, which is the software I used for all the sound design in this game. And basically, I just walk you through each layer to see what they sound like individually. And then at the very end, you'll hear how they all come together. And you might be wondering how I recorded a lot of this stuff. A lot of it is the result of that wire recorder, and that's how I could get kind of such strange, artifacty, kind of distorted sounds. So this will walk you through every layer, and then all together at the end. It's a little bassier in
Listen
here
to
than
that
it.
flutter echo. Wow.
Yeah, that delay is not actually part of the effect. So
So it's just kind of a quick example of a sound effect in a game using old sound effects.
So next up is shaders. Shaders can be used to make assets look completely different. This goes from anything to vertex shaders, which means that you're changing the actual shape of the object, to fragment shaders, which means you're changing the colors of the object, or a mix of both, or there's also other ones, other shaders, but those are like the 2 primary ones, I think. But if you make shaders in such a way with different parameters, for example, you're able to kind of reuse them to make different assets look different ways. For example, this one here with the water and the lava was probably a shader or something of some sort, where all you do is apply the shader to this object, and then you have a texture or 2 assigned to that shader where you can just swap out those values, those parameters, which then completely changes the look of the object. And it's probably something similar with this other example here. With, I think those are, I don't know, whatever, the army guys. But yeah, similar thing with that as well. Do you think
Yeah,
that-
so like what Mitch was saying, you can use one base object and you can apply a bunch of different effects, get a bunch of different outcomes. Saves a ton of space on your games. And then shaders are always running through the GPU, so you do have to keep that in mind. So make sure that if you're using a lot of shaders, you're using or you're programming for a graphic capable system, let's just say. Your iPhone is probably not a good
No.
system to develop with shaders for. That you might have to use a lot more different textures and stuff like that. But if you're programming for modern hardware and large beefy computers and game systems, game consoles, you can do a lot more shaders to kind of reduce the workload. And like Mitch was saying with the water texture here and the lava texture, that's the exact same texture. They just went in and they applied a different shader, and that changed both the color and the kind of individual look of those 2 objects.
If you're interested in learning more about shaders, there's definitely lots of YouTube tutorials on it. I know Unity has like their own tutorial page for shaders, and they go through like a list of like 12 different examples and all the different things you can do with them. So, oh, and just here's another example of different sorts of shaders that you can do. But like I said, with the vertex one on the left, that's completely changing the shape of the object. That looks really weird. But then there's a bunch of other things. I don't even know what like half of these are, but a lot of them also deal with lighting. Shaders are usually what's responsible for like showing a shadow or doing lighting, because that pretty much all lighting is usually done on the GPU, just because there's a ton of calculations that's to do every frame, so it's just a lot easier for it to do that way.
The two most common shaders you probably see in a lot of games is the outline shader, which just puts an outline around everything to kind of make it look more cartoony in 2D. And the other one is the cell shader, which makes it more comic book kind of like, simplifies the lighting a lot, breaks it down and makes it more, again, cartoony and two-dimensional.
Yeah, I mean, generally lighting is technically also a shader, but it's like the default, so. Oh, also refractions like water can also be a shader. Typically in most video games, if you have like a giant body of water that's like waving around, it's actually just normally just a shader. In the actual game, it's just a flat surface, but then they have a shader that makes it look like it's actually water moving around, because that would be really hard for the computer to do all of that on the CPU every frame, whereas the GPU can handle it just fine because it has lots of different stuff going on. So,
out of curiosity, who here would be interested in an introduction to shaders in Unity, like a workshop?
oh wait,
I'm seeing a lot of hands, so we'll definitely keep that in mind. Thank you, guys.
okay, so that's everything with reusing, kind of. We'll probably touch on it again. The other thing you should take advantage of is free things on the internet. Just be careful sometimes. So there's a lot of official places to get assets. If you download anything off of any of the asset stores or marketplaces for popular game engines, Unity, GameMaker, Unreal, even Itch has their own asset page. If it's free on there, it's free to use however you'd like. Typically is how it goes. There's not going to be any caveats, anything like that. Whereas there are some other websites, if you just find something online where they say it's free, but then like you have to credit the author or you have to make a donation or something, and that's like small text, so you gotta watch out for that sometimes, so you don't get in legal trouble if you do publish something that makes money and then they're like, actually that's my stuff, so you should pay me for it. Whereas all the asset stores, I'm pretty sure they make them sign some agreement or something when you publish something saying that it is free. So. And GitHub libraries are also a good place. Again, you got to look for a license of some sort and just read the license. Usually if it's like MIT that says like, oh, it's free to use, copy and paste, however you'd like, modify it, doesn't matter. Whereas some of them, if they don't have a license, that means you can't use it. That is their code. It's just public so you can view it, but not so you can use it. So again, that's something else just to watch out for. And then there's also other free websites as well. Like I listed a couple here. Freesound.org is good for sound effects. I think it's getting a little dated. I don't know how many people post to it all too often anymore. But there might be other similar websites out there. And then there's also shadertoy.com, which has a lot of like cool free shaders that you can see. And that website's pretty cool too. It lets you preview them before you download them, so you actually know what they're doing.
Shader Toy is really cool. If you guys work at all with shaders, or you're interested in working on all with shaders, I highly recommend you go to that website and check it out and goof around with it. You can actually look at the code that they have uploaded and modify it in real time, and it'll update the shader in real time. You can upload files to the website to test out if your assets would look good with that shader applied to them. And people just make crazy stuff on that website and upload it for free. So it's a really, really, really great resource. And then, again, like Mitch said, with the licenses, be really careful with those. Just make sure that when you see a license, look it up. If it doesn't include a license, probably don't download it, unless, of course, it's on one of those stores. If you use an asset store, it's usually pretty simple. You click download, it goes into a separate browser, and it's usually pretty straightforward. And if you don't know, there's tons of tutorials on how to download stuff from these stores. And one thing we didn't really mention, but I do want to bring up really quickly, is like fonts. Fonts is a huge thing that's very reusable, and you can definitely use fonts that exist online. But again, you have to be very careful with those. Usually you have to include the license that you need for the font in your game's files. And I would recommend you look into that But it is important to note that what's called typeface, I believe, not the type script of the font, isn't legally protected in the US. So what I mean by that is you have a font file, for example, and that's what the computer uses to generate that font, right? What it looks like. But if you just copy a font and you draw it and you save it as images, separate images that aren't in a font file, that's called like a typeface or a font face. And that isn't technically, and hey, I'm not a legal advisor here, but that isn't usually technically protected at all. So you can, copy fonts or try to do stuff with font, or if you're drawing, let's say, a menu for your game, if you're hand drawing it, you're not using a font to generate that, you can usually get away with that.
There's also some websites online that help you make fonts pretty easily. I forget the name of the one that I've used before, but it lets you it's almost like pixel art, but different shapes, yeah.
Fontstruct?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good resource. It's kind of like, it's a great resource for making fonts. I've used it before, and also people post a lot of things they make on there with the tool, so it's nice. Some you can make pretty much anything. It's basically like a big list of tools that are all different shapes, and then you just make the font letter by letter. It's pretty nice.
Do you know if that's pixel or vector-based font editing?
I think it's vector-based, but
I'm pretty sure it's-
pixel art while you're doing it.
Okay.
Kind of cool.
It's like a grid, and then you have different shapes you can place. So there are like flat out boxes, but then you can also do circles and like curves and stuff.
Okay, because I know there's also a lot where you draw like individual pixels and stuff like that.
Yeah, but you're not drawing the actual pixels. You're just doing like
Right.
a block structure or something. So
Okay.
I don't know. It's nice. I've used it to make pixel looking text, so that makes it really easy. But you could also make cooler things. Yeah, fonts, definitely another thing. Yeah.
Oh, one last thing with fonts. If you look at the stuff that's on your computer that already was downloaded when you got your computer, stuff is usually very good, right? That's in the public domain. You don't need to clear any special licenses with it.
Yeah,
So if you
Arial.
can get those to work, that's great. All right. If you can get those to work, don't even bother going online looking for some. But if you need something really stylized or really specific, then you can go online and try to dig around for a free font, or pay for one if you're willing to do that.
You probably find a free one that looks good. Okay. Next, organization. So after you have created assets, created different things for games, it's good to find a way to be able to organize this stuff so you can find it and reuse it later. If you just keep everything in the original project, that's great, but if you go in the future, you maybe forget what project it's in, but you know you've made it before, or you just eventually just lose it in your files on your computer. It's always good to stay organized so you can not have that happen. So yeah, again, keep assets in places where they're easy to find. Recommend either a folder, GitHub page, something, Dropbox, I don't care. But something that you can always find it later. And again, libraries or packages. I know with Unity at least, they have a package system where you can organize things in a folder in such a way that Unity recognizes it as something it can import. So then say that you make like a bunch of platformer like game objects and art assets and sound effects. And you're like, okay, this is nice. I would like to reuse it in another platform in the future. If you make it into a package, then all you have to do when you want to reuse it is you import it, import the package, and it will have all of your stuff there. Anything from the asset store is pretty much put into a package that you just download and import. So you're basically just making something that would be on the asset store. But that's a good way to save things so that if you want to reuse it, it's really easy just to implement it and keep using it. Again, store online, GitHub, whatever else. And then with the packages, you can also, if you think it's something other people will use, you could also just post it online in general. It will be there forever until either they delete it because it's outdated or you take it off there. So.
Every modern game engine usually has some sort of like asset library you can upload it and download stuff from. Just go and usually you like right click on your object or whatever you want to store, and then there's usually like a tab to like add it to library. And that'll allow you to really easily get at all that stuff that you have across all of your projects. It's a lot faster than stopping the project you're working in, opening another project, waiting for it to open, getting that file, moving it somewhere else, reopening your current project. It's just a lot easier, a lot more convenient, and it's just a lot nicer overall. I think that's all I have to say on organization.
Same. Okay. So in the future, say that you have all this in your mind, in mind, and you go to make another game. You ask yourself a few questions. How is this game similar to one you've made before? So if you're making, again, with the platformer example, if you're making another platformer, like how is it similar? And then is it worth taking any assets from it? So one thing that we've been talking about a lot today is reusing stuff. But in all honesty, sometimes you make something like 2 years ago, and then you're like, oh, I remember I made a platform script that helps me with platforms or whatever. And then you go and look at it and you're like, oh my God, this thing is crap. So you don't want to necessarily always reuse things, but most of the time it's good to, just so you can save time. But if you look at it and you're like, okay, I could probably just remake this. It wouldn't take me that much time. Like, then it's worth it, especially if it works way better. You don't like have to reuse something. It's kind of a judgment call. So
Get creative with it. Maybe you're working on a 3D game and you have a bunch of 2D assets. Well, what can you do with those? You can go and maybe you can make a loading screen or some two-dimensional feature like a graphic interface, a menu, something like that. The more simple an existing object that you have is, the more usable it usually is. If you just have like a table, for example, that's just like a block and legs, you can turn that into a lot of other things. You can use it as a base. If you're making a 2D game, you have a bunch of 3D assets, you can do some cool stuff where you pre-render that, right? You can go into like a graphics engine or some sort of a modeling tool, and you can do a bunch of cool stuff with shaders and stuff in there, render it as like a flat image, download that flat image and use that in your project as like a background or a menu or whatever you need it for. And there's just a ton of really unique ways you can save time by reusing assets without making it really obvious that you just went into an old file and grabbed an old project and stuff like that.
yeah, something you also want to be aware of is like with art and things, you can reuse art, but it's really obvious. So the only like 2 circumstances you would actually reuse a piece of art, like directly use that piece of art, would be if you're making like a sequel or something related to the original game, or if the original game was just like is completely unheard of, and you just don't want to like remake that art. You figured you could just use it again, no one would notice. So
A really bad example of reusing stuff is RPG Maker games. Because that is an asset library that everyone basically reuses, right? Those were created and those are used by a lot of people who don't know how to make their own assets. And that can be great when you're getting started. And that can even be done. I've seen some projects where it's like a joke, right? I have these free assets, I'm going to put them in, make a joke out of the game, make it goofy, probably use stock images or something like that. And just kind of make like a goofy project. And for that, that's fine. But if you're doing a professional project, you want to sell it professionally, then you're best off making your stuff from scratch. Hopefully asking somebody in the club to help you out with making stuff if you don't know how to yourself, or coming to workshops and learning how to make stuff, right? That's always another option as well. And if you're ever looking for something that you don't know how to do yourself, feel free to ask around at the club, feel free to ask us, and definitely ask in the Discord, because there is usually somebody there who's more than happy to work on stuff with people. So
I can't find an example. I thought maybe I could. But also be cautious with free assets sometimes. Sometimes it's really obvious, especially if people that have made games before, that you are using a free asset pack. Maybe that's a turnoff for them as a player. But there was this guy that a while back that made a Unity tutorial game, and he published it on Steam for like $200, and people were actually buying it. Mostly as a joke for like YouTube videos. I don't know if any serious like normal person bought it, because it was literally just like a bunch of waves of like zombies. Like it was literally just the tutorial. They didn't add anything special to it at all. So like that's something you don't want to do in general, but
Well, maybe you do. It just sounds like a really funny way to make a lot of money really quickly.
yeah,
can
especially
try.
especially when one person
People bought it.
yeah, one person buys your game and you've already made a profit because you've already made enough money. Like Steam takes their 33% cut, which means you have $120 or whatever left. And then there's a $100 publishing fee, so you've already made $20. And as soon as the second person buys something, you're actually making... Don't do that though, that's dumb.
yeah, those are usually called asset flips, when you just go and you get a bunch of asset packs that already exist, everyone knows about them, everyone's seen them before, and you just reuse them without any edits, right? But there are some games that people have made that have been very, impressive, have done really well. I don't know. Does anybody know the game? There's like a game where he plays like a fox. Sorry?
Tunic?
No, different Fox game. There's a Fox game though. There's a game where he plays a fox that this guy developed. No, that's Nintendo doesn't asset flip. They know to a degree. They know better than to just directly asset flip. But there was a guy who made a game. He just used a lot of existing assets, and then he went and modified them, used shaders, tried to make them look unique to that game, so people couldn't just like look at it and go, "Oh, he just went and downloaded that." And he published it. He did it really quickly. I think he made a game in like a year using that. Published it, did really well, and now he's a successful game developer. Wish I could tell you the name of that. If I come up with that, maybe I'll post it in the Discord. But
The first tree?
yes, The First Tree. That's the name of the game. Has anybody heard of that before? No? Okay. Well, he was successful. He's still making games to this day. And he is a big proponent of just finding assets online because he didn't know how to do any of that himself. So.
Yeah, and that's another thing too is kind of mixing and matching. Like if you find something online, making it look unique. So it's kind of like a good starting point. If you want something simple, so you don't have to make everything from scratch, and then you can change that a bit just so it's not blatantly obvious that you just copied it from the asset store. So.
Yep.
So, again, with the announcements, next week is music workshop. So if you're wanting to learn how to make music or music theory, definitely recommend coming. I don't know how long it'll be. Hopefully an hour to 2 in that range. But I'm also not leading it. So, and then again, social night next Friday. So not this Friday, but next week in Marston 2200. 7 to 11. Come anytime you want. And yeah.
Oh, do you want to announce the game jam at all? Because we do have a time and a place.
Yeah, I already did that at the beginning.
Do you want to announce it again?
Yes. Game Jam, March 24th through 26th, 7 to 7 p.m. in Ellings 308 in the basement like it was last time.
We'll be talking more about it later, so don't worry if you don't memorize all that right away. We'll have a lot more announcements and a lot more information about what a game jam even is for those of you who don't know. So that'll be coming up. Just keep that in mind that it is coming up in March, right the weekend after we get back from break. So.
Yep. Not the weekend like that's part of break, but the one after that, like first week of classes after break. So, all right. Go forth, make games, and be awesome.